Good morning, Facebook friends. Welcome to Nehemiah Lesson One. We were just talking about how, one of the students was saying how she had forgotten how long the homework took. I won't call her by name, Sherry. No, I just teasing. Let me turn this off real quick. I had a good time getting into this week and putting this lesson together, so I'm looking forward to this. I'm looking forward to learning what you guys have learned. So let's start with a word of prayer this morning, then we'll dive in. Father, thank you so much for this time this morning, Lord. Thank you for the opportunity to study your word and to gather in community to study, Lord. I so appreciate just the learning that happens when we're willing to share individually what you're doing in our hearts, God. And so I just pray that you open our hearts today to what we can learn from each other, and just continue to help us keep our hearts open to what you would individually have us learn as we move through these chapters of Nehemiah, Lord. Again, just thank you for the opportunity to study, and thank you for communicating to us through your word. And we ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, let's start with, there's somebody waiting to get in. Let's start with let's do some historical setting. And if you want, let's go to page 8 in your homework just to start. We're just going to do a little bit of background, some things that we found background, and then we'll dive into chapter 1 in just a few minutes. So let's look on page 8, and we're just going to focus on 3a. We're going to kind of look at the whole page, but right now we're going to focus on 3a, kind of that from 2nd Chronicles. If you had time to look that information up, because that was helpful. We're looking in 2nd Chronicles for the key things that happened to the people in the city. So let's just look at what it says in number 3 right there on page 8, that this is what's happened to God's covenant people, right? This is like maybe the third line right there. That God sent prophet after prophet to his people to warn them to turn from the very sin Nehemiah is confessing. When we read his prayer in chapter 1, we hear him say, forgive my sins, the sins of my father, the sins of the people of Israel. And so this is the sin that we're looking at here in 2nd Chronicles that he's confessing, but they did not listen. And so God, who watches over his word to perform it, executed his word just as he said. The curses, and we always struggle with that word a little bit because it sounds a little bit like witchcrafty. I mean, I do. I don't know. I shouldn't put that on you guys, but I do a little bit like the curses, But the negative consequences that are natural when we will not turn away from sin. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. Okay, because when we do not keep our life in line with the commandments of God, we leave room for the enemy's work in our life. And then when we make decisions that are not in line with God, there are going to be natural consequences of those. They're going to come into our lives, and the result will be captivity, right? And so this is, as this played out for the people of Israel, so it plays out in our life as well, right? And then there's this opportunity to return and rebuild and create a barrier, a stronger barrier between us and the attack of the enemy. So he executed his word just as he said. The curses came into full bloom, and an awful harvest followed. And so 2nd Chronicles 36, what are some of the key things that happened to the people in the city? What have they experienced that kind of helps us understand the state that they're in right now?
After the takeover.
Yes.
Yeah, mass building. They were handed over to the ones that survived were handed over to Nezer.
Yes. So many were killed. Mm-hmm. They were taken captive. Who are they taken captive and killed by at this point? Who is the enemy at this point? Babylon. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What happened to the temple?
It was the palaces were burned, and the temple was burned also.
Mm-hmm. If you're just joining us, we're on page 8, just looking at some historical background from 2nd Chronicles. So that's why we're just kind of talking about what we found there in 2nd Chronicles, kind of like what's the state of the city and the people. So yeah, they were killed. They were carried off captive into a foreign land. The temple was burned, destroyed. The temple treasures were carried off. What happened to the walls?
was torn down.
Yeah, they broke down the walls. Everything of value was destroyed. A remnant was carried off to Babylon, right? And they were servants to the
Things from
king.
the temple, many of the things from the temple were taken to Babylon.
Everything.
Right. Yes. And then they would stay there for a period of 70 years, right? Before they were allowed to return.
Well, Angie?
Yeah.
In the very beginning of this, it said, I thought it was interesting that God sent messengers to warn the people, and the people mocked the messengers.
Yeah, who are the messengers?
Prophets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those Old Testament.
God's wrath arose against them after that. So
Sure.
all of this,
Yeah.
that's
For those of you who have,
when he sent the Chaldeans,
for those of you who have studied some of the prophets with me in precept, we had this cycle of sin, right? That we studied. I think we talked about that so much in Jeremiah, where there's this like turning away from God. Then there's consequences for that. Then there's crying out to God, and then there's restoration, and then there's this period of peace, right? And then there's turning away from God, and so there was this like repeated cycle. But more and more they turned away from God, and when God sent His messengers, and there were a variety of people that God called to speak a message to the people, and what always was the message of the prophets?
Repent.
Yeah, turn away from what you're looking at and turn towards God, right? Yeah, there's always this turn away, turns towards. Turn away from the idols that you're worshiping and turn back towards your holy covenant with a living God, right? That you are His people, and He has promised you these things. But we cannot receive, even though He offers us covenant relationship, we will not receive His blessings when we will not humble ourselves and obey Him. And that plays out in our lives just as it played out in theirs over and over again, right? And so they mocked the people that He sent to try to help them. They mocked them, they killed them, and they did what they wanted to do. And eventually, politically, they were in a weakened state because of alliances they had made. I mean, if you just look at the reason why, like the political reason why, they were in a weakened state, and so they were vulnerable for takeover, if you will, just to simplify it. But in a spiritual state, He did not continue to offer His protection the way that He had said that He was going to protect, because He says, I will fight for you, I will protect you if you what? If you are in right relationship with me, right? And it's not, even when I say that, it sounds like, well, if you don't do what I tell you to, then I'm not going to do what I say I'm going to do. But it's much more loving than that. I mean, I think we have to be careful with that, right? Because the reality is He will always fight for us, and He is always fighting for us. But when we do not humble ourselves to His directions, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust not in yourself, lean not in your own understanding, but in all, it would help me.
Acknowledge
Right.
Him.
Thank you. When we will not, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. It worked in my head. When we will not, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, then we actually are not allowing Him to fight for us, right? We're not receiving the fact that He fights for us. And then at some point, we deal with the consequences of Him not fighting for us. So, yeah, a couple of people were talking.
God's promises are conditional, but His love is unconditional. But some of His promises are conditional. And Nehemiah quotes one later on. But some of His promises are conditional, and that's one of them.
Well, yes, and I would say to that degree, I mean, but it's so up to us, right? I mean, because if we do not follow Him, if we do not align our lives with Him to the degree that we won't do that, we actually are saying no thank you to your promises, and the good news always is, as soon as we put our hand down and say, actually, this isn't working very well, me trying to do it on my own, right? Then His love, because His love is new every morning, and His offer of reconciliation is always ours. Yeah. And it was for them too, even in the midst of all this, right? He promises that I will always take care of you. As much as the destruction is going to come, so will the reconciliation, right? But like that's the Jeremiah, is it 29 or 39:11, right? Because I know the promises I have for you, I will restore you, right? That's what he's talking about there. So in on page 8, number 2, I think we already kind of talked about that. It was Babylon, and Jerusalem had been burned and torn down and destroyed. And then at the bottom, it was asking how long the walls had been down and who was king and all that. Anything there that, what did you write down there? Trying to get my video up the way I need to.
I said it was 141 years according to my math. And
Me too.
the walls were down because of the persistent disobedience of the Jews not to return to the ways of God.
Yeah. Yes, good. Anything else there, like just kind of like with history or anything from that page that you thought was particularly interesting? Or
The king,
yes, who was the king?
well, I don't know how to pronounce it, Artaxerxes?
Yeah, Artaxerxes is,
Artaxerxes.
yeah, yeah.
What? How do you pronounce it?
I think Artaxerxes. I think it's Xerxes.
Yeah.
Artaxerxes.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because he's the one that's went back to, was it Ezra who went back the first time to started the temple?
Look at your
He
chart.
was the king. who
Look
made
at your
the
chart
decree.
on. Look
Yeah,
at your
that he-
chart on 107.
107.
Just because it's
Wasn't it
confusing.
Nebuchadnezzar? Wasn't it Nebuchadnezzar who was there when the
That's the one who
went
took him.
down?
We're later than that now.
Yeah,
When the
Yeah.
walls went down, though.
with
Nebuchadnezzar when the walls went down. Yep, in
So,
586.
Nebuchadnezzar
Yep.
was the one when the walls went down. Yeah.
And remember, we talked about this last week. Remember that when the walls came down, that would have been under Babylon. But then
Right.
before they go back, there's this Mede Persia overtakes Babylon, and then eventually Persia is the dominant. So when it's overtaken, we're talking about a Babylonian king, and now in this book of Nehemiah, we're talking about a Persian king. Just so you know, yeah. So.
Right.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But you see that if you look at 107, you see that at the top, under the main headline, the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, then you'll say Babylonian kings. And for those of you on Facebook, I'm looking at this chart
yeah,
right here.
yeah.
Medio-Persian king.
And that's just
Yeah.
that's just a historical political thing as
Yeah.
countries take over each other. Yeah. But you can see about
Nehemiah, he started at the very beginning saying that he was in Persia also. I mean, his king was in the capital of Persia.
right.
So at that point, we kind of knew that it was past the Babylonian time.
Right. Let's talk about Nehemiah himself just a little bit. Who was Nehemiah? Give me a little bit of a who about Nehemiah.
The son of Hilkiah, cupbearer to the king.
Yep.
Very important person, although I think he was also very smart, and as you get into two, he
Very
seemed
smart.
to be a lot smarter. Yeah, he was a great
And
leader.
organized.
And knew how to deal with people, if you would. I don't know. I didn't ever think about him being such a leader as I now think of him in 2 chapters.
What was his nationality? What kind of
Jewish.
who were his people? Yeah, so he was a Jew. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note he was a good leader, and he was an organizer and an encourager of people. But first and foremost, he was a devout Jew, right? And we see this because when he learns what has happened in Jerusalem, or the state of Jerusalem, because he knows what has happened, but the state of Jerusalem, and we'll get to this in a minute. But his first action is not
over that.
his first response is not to demand an audience with the king, right?
Yeah.
His first response is to what?
Pray and
Pray to
fast.
God.
To pull away and pray. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, and he was in Susa, which was the main city of Persian kingdom, a pagan society. Important to remember that. And then also he served Artaxerxes as his cupbearer. That's at the end of chapter 1. We learned that. And then, and it is confusing. And if you look at the chart again on 107, so if you are familiar with the book of Esther, the king in that is Xerxes. Ahasuerus, I think is his name, but his name is Xerxes, and this king is after him, Artaxerxes. It's confusing, but I just encourage you to just take a look at that and keep referring back to it. I have to look that stuff up from time to time because I find it very difficult to keep all that in my head. But
Me too.
yeah. So let's look on page 7.
So these are two different people. I don't think that hit me.
The Xerxes in Esther is not this king.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
And I see that now as
Yep.
I look further down on that graph. Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
But it is confusing. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so page 7, number 2B. Let's look at that in Deuteronomy. Because we're going to look a little bit deeper. Why is he in Susa and not in Israel? Right? I mean, because they've been carried off. But let's look at what we read. We're going to talk about the promises that God, in Deuteronomy here, we're going to talk about the promises that God has made them, right? What are the main...
Where are we, Angie? I'm lost. Where are we?
Page 7 at the bottom,
Where?
2B in
Okay.
Deuteronomy.
Yep.
Yep.
Gotcha.
And we were...
Oh, okay.
There we were looking up some of the main things that God promises. And this is important.
Yeah.
This goes like what Denise was just saying. Some of God's promises are conditional. His love is not conditional. Some of his promises are conditional, right? And it's like, I think, you've probably heard me say this a dozen times, but in so many of the verses in the Bible and so many of the stories of the Bible, there's a my job, your job, right? And I always use one of my favorite verses is Psalm 37:4. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. It's a very clear my job, your job. My job is to take delight in the Lord. His job is to give me the desires of my heart, right? When we confuse those things, then we get frustrated in our relationship with God. My job is to tell you what the desires of my heart is, and your job is to give them to me. We sometimes think that it works like that, right? But the reality is, what does the verse say? Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. And so I think this...
And our job comes first.
Yes, that's a good point. I mean, yes, I would suggest that his job of loving us is always first. It leads with love, right? But
Yeah.
relationally, what he can and will do in our lives depends so much on our response to him.
On how we respond.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So the love is there. I like how you're saying that though, Mary Ellen. The love is always present. And as Denise said, that's unconditional. This is kind of coming into my head right now. So we'll see if we agree with it when I say it, right? So the love is always present and it is unconditional. And there's nothing we can do about it. It's just there, right? We can't make it go away. We can't run from it, hide from it, nothing. It's just there. That's first. Then we have this choice. How do we respond to the love that is there, right? Based on our response to that, he can and will work through us, bless us, grow us, use us, and give us the desires of our hearts. Now, I have to put a little asterisk by desires of our hearts. That does not mean he gives us what we want. It means he gives us what he knows we want. All right, what he knows we need. And so, but the more that we take delight in him, the more that we Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, and don't trust ourselves, but trust in his leading. Okay. So I don't want us to, this is not prosperity preaching. If you just do the right thing, then you'll get rich.
Yeah.
Just, that's what the asterisk says. Don't send me
I know
emails.
that earlier in life.
But there definitely is. There's a woman whose ministry that I admire very much. Her name is Joanna Weaver. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her work. She wrote some years ago. She wrote a book called Having a Merry Heart in a Martha World, and she spoke at a writers' conference that I attended a couple of years ago, and she said something to me that made such a profound impact on my life. I think of it so often. I may have shared this before, but she was talking about us in ministry and how tempting it sometimes is to focus on trying to grow our ministry and what we're doing and all that. And she said very clearly, she said that the Lord kind of really just spoke this truth in her life, that my job is to deepen the message and his job is to grow the ministry. And I think that is so true no matter what our life is. When we have questions, when I get confused about what I need to do, whether it's in my vocation in ministry or whether it's in my life, a lot of times what I'm trying to do in that confusion is do his job, right? My job is not to make all these decisions. My job is to cling to you and listen to you and follow your lead. Your job is to be the leader, right? But I don't know about y'all, but I get very confused about that somehow, very frequently. So some of his promises on page 7b at the very bottom were to restore their fortunes, to have compassion on them, to gather them, and to bring them back to the land of their ancestors. Because he had said to them that this land will be yours and it will be overflowing with good things, right? And so after a period of reconciliation, repentance and reconciliation, there would be a time when they would be restored, right? Let's look at Yep. On page 9 at the top. This is around 536 BC. And so what under Cyrus began to happen there? What'd you learn there? In 536 is when they
made a proclamation.
Yeah, when they can first go back, right?
Oh.
And again, you can look on this chart. I think this chart, this chart's going to be really helpful to us, I think. Because you can look at, that's the first wave, the 3 returns from exile. Do you see that? Those have the big numbers with the arrows. Yeah. 536 under Cyrus.
Cyrus was the first wave, is that correct?
I'm sorry?
Yes.
Cyrus was the first wave.
Under
correct?
Cyrus was the first wave, yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yep. And then lastly, before we kind of get into the chapter on Ezra 1, on page 9, still about halfway down, Ezra 1, it asks some of the events of what happened when they first went back. Anybody have some stuff from there that you want to... Ultimately, what happened? We can answer that simply. What are they rebuilding? Yeah, they're rebuilding the temple.
The first one was the temple.
Right. Yeah. So if you look on the chart, I just had a couple of things just for time frame. To look back on the chart 107. So in 536, you'll notice that they begin work on the temple. And then 2 years later, then the work stops. You see that on 534? Yeah. And remember, it kind of gets confusing because we're working backwards with the dates now. So the dates are going to get smaller, but that's actually moving forward, right? So, yeah, because it's BC. So that gets confusing a little bit. And then about 14 years later, 520, the temple work resumes. And then it's completed in 516. You guys see where I am? And then now we're all the way on return number 3. And so
just for before that, up in 4, I didn't do a whole lot of wording. That King Cyrus also gave them back the treasures that were taken from the temple by Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes.
So
Yeah, good point. So I just say all that so that we just kind of familiarize ourselves with that chart just a little bit and get an idea, because I think what is helpful in looking at all this, the point for me is this was a big situation. It was complicated. It'd been this way for a long time. This was not an easy fix. Other people had tried it. And there was a lot of reason to just leave it alone. All right. And so again, as we think about application, as we go through this, probably most of us can identify with a time when the job at hand seemed overwhelming. There were many obstacles to getting from point A to point B. Obviously, some rebuilding needed to take place, but where to begin seemed like a very difficult question to have an answer to. Anybody? You know what I'm saying? And so yes, he was a good leader. Yes, he was organized. Yes, he understood what needed to happen. But he also began with prayer, as we're going to see. He began with a time of connecting to God. He began with a time of confession about his part in all of this and asking for guidance, right, as he began to move forward. And so I just think that's a really important thing to remember. Because it's fun to learn the history of the wall and stuff, and I think that's cool and that's good to know. But I think we always have to be asking the so what. And as we get into Nehemiah, as we get into the story, when we understand what he was up against, I think then we can better understand what kind of man he was and how this was successful.
He couldn't do this without God's help.
Sure.
I mean, from the very, very beginning, I think he was very cognizant of that, or he wouldn't have been so grieved over the news itself, don't you?
Yeah, well, of course, yeah. And I think, isn't that step one for most of us when we face something that's really challenging?
All of a sudden it just slaps you in the face.
To be able to say, acknowledge, I recognize I cannot do this by myself, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because that's
one of the things that I read was that it took Jews 52 days to rebuild the wall. So this was a 52-day project, but it had 4 months of prayer as the foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I thought that was
Yeah.
There was 4 months between when he found out how bad it was and he went to the king. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Is that correct?
Yep, that is correct. Yeah. So let's jump into chapter 1. And before I forget, I just want to, for those of you who like to keep track, let's do a chapter theme on page 105. And if you're new to precept in the appendix, usually, I don't know, that's where I put mine. 105, there's a chart that looks like this. And a lot of times we like to put our chapter themes on there. So anybody want to share your chapter theme for 1? What you got? There's no right or wrong. Well, if you put Jonah was swallowed by a fish for chapter 1, that's wrong.
I put Nehemiah mourns through Jerusalem's condition.
Okay.
It's pretty bland, but
it's very similar.
Yeah.
Nehemiah hears, grieves, prays.
Yes. Yeah. I put Nehemiah mourns for Jerusalem / seeks God. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which I think, even, when you boil it down like that, I'm comforted by that too, because when Nehemiah learns that something really bad is the reality, right? There is a period of mourning. Now, we studied the book of Nehemiah and we're like, hey, Nehemiah was this great man and he prayed to God and he got the work done and that's all good. And all that's correct, right? But I think it's important in our own application to say, here are some things that he went through when our family was hit head on and our life was turned upside down. It took me a while to get to the place of prayer and seeking God, because at first I was in shock and I was grieving and my life was completely unrecognizable, right? And so and that's part of what we do. At first we mourn, we grieve, we struggle through that, and then as people of faith, then hopefully our call is then to turn our face towards God and to acknowledge, I need you and I can't do this on my own. And hopefully as we mature, what happens is that gap of time gets smaller, right? That we more quickly recognize, hey, I'm in a state here, I'm in a mess, and I need to turn my face quickly, and that we don't spend months or years or whatever, spinning our wheels and trying to make our own way. But I say that as encouragement, because there is a period of mourning, and it is good to mourn it. It's just not authentic, I think, when we go through something really challenging and all we say is, God is good, it'll be fine. There's a period where we're like, I don't understand this and I don't like it. I think that's a place that deserves recognition as well. So, okay, so verse 3, right off the bat, Nehemiah hears a report, right, from his brother And I read a couple of things. Some indicated they thought this probably was his brother, like biological brother. Others said more like a Jewish brother, you know, but I don't know. But it says, my brother, and the Jewish remnant who had returned, verse 3, are in distress and reproach, right? Because why? Why are they struggling?
The walls are broken down and the gates are burned.
Yes, right. Yeah, because it's still just in quite a mess. And I wanted to read just a couple of sentences. I'm still trying to decide if I like this commentary. If anybody else has commentaries they're using and you like them, I love hearing about them. But this commentary so far just really focuses on gleaning the leadership principles from this book, which is kind of interesting, but I'm still trying to decide if I like it. But I thought this was interesting. It says, apparently this was also when the Jews first tried to rebuild the wall and so provide for the city's defenses. The opening report in Nehemiah, the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire, probably relates to an effort by Rehum and Shimshai to defeat this first attempt, rather than to the original destruction of the wall by the Babylonians in 580 C. So Boyce is suggesting that this might be like a new state of distress, and because any progress they had made had been attacked. It doesn't say that in here specifically, but from some history, he's pulling this out and saying they might be in distress still from 586 when the first thing happened, but there's historical suggestion that they might have been distressed because it was in a state already and now it's been like reattacked, sort of. So just FYI.
I did read that there was a first attempt at building the wall and that it was shut down pretty quickly because people in the area, some of the leaders in the area wrote to the king and said, oh, these people are rebelling.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Said, oh, you got to crush that right away.
Yes, yes. And that's part of the problem in this one. We did that in this lesson, I think, because this king is the one that shut it down, right? That Nehemiah has to go to now and ask for. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. That adds to his fear. Right, exactly. So when you looked at, I don't know if you looked at the map. I don't know if I read a couple of suggestions about how far it was from Susa to Jerusalem. Did anybody see anything about that? I read
800 miles.
So I read in one place it was 700. Boyce in this book suggests it's 1,500. So
I read 800, and that was enduring word.
Okay, all right. So some discrepancy. Far, I think that's fair to say. It was far. Yeah.
Yeah. Or ride a horse. It's a really long way.
It was a really long way, but yeah. This Boyce said 1,500, and that's the highest that I'd seen. I'd seen more 700 to 800 in the things that I was reading too. But okay, so what is, starting in verse 4? Then what is Nehemiah's response? We've talked about this a little bit already.
He wept and mourned. Mm-hmm. He fell from his feet.
Yep, yeah. So I think that response, he wept and mourned, and then he fasted and prayed. So, I think that's important to note, that there's this time of just absorbing the situation, right? And then hopefully very quickly we turn that grief into prayer. And yes, he did pray or wait. I don't, who knows what that looked like exactly, but the time span here is about 4 months between the time that he learns of this and prays and then goes to the king. Interesting, he begins this prayer by calling out to God, the Lord God of heaven, verse 5, the great and awesome God, who preserves and keeps his covenant, who has loving kindness, steadfast love. He's basing this prayer about what he already knows the Lord has promised to do, right? I think that can be so comforting for us when we seek God in prayer, is to remember his promises and state them out loud. Not because he needs reminding, right? But we need reminding sometimes. And I think the thing, the main promise that God states always is, I will be with you. I will not leave you. I will not forsake you. I heard a sermon on neither leave nor forsake by T.D. Jakes. I don't know if any of you are familiar with his work. I know Lisa is, because she and I've listened to him preach through the years. He was talking about the idea of neither leave nor forsake. And I don't know about y'all, but I don't think that I've really, until I heard him preach on it, I hadn't really ever separated those things in my mind, because it's forsake sounds like another way to say leave to me. But he was talking about how leave is like a physical leave, but forsake is like an emotional leave, because sometimes people have left you, but they're not gone. And he unpacked that a little bit, and I thought there was such power in that. It's like, not only will I not leave you, but I also will not leave you, right? Have you ever been in a relationship when you knew the person was gone, right? And they might physically still be here, but they emotionally left this relationship a long time ago or something? Yeah. And so I think there's something about that. Not only will I not leave you, but I will not depart my emotion from you. I will not stop loving you. I will not give up on you, right? And that's what he promises us. And I think all that to say, when we take that to him in prayer, as we pray to him, when we feel left and abandoned, I'll go back to my situation, when you look at your life and all of a sudden that it's in ruins, and you say, it feels like you left me, but you are a God who promises never to leave me, never to forsake me. What does that feel like when you say that out loud? It feels different than if you just say, I need you to heal this body, or I need you to fix this situation, or I need you to, right? You remember that even if this is the reality of your situation, he has promised not to leave you nor forsake you. I think that's what Nehemiah is doing right here. He knew the promises of the Lord, and he knew God's word, because he uses them in how he prays, right? He prays them. So in verse 6, he asks the Lord to hear his prayer of confession. On behalf of who or whom?
On behalf of everyone, all of Israel, and sons of Israel, and he includes himself in that as well, even though obviously he's a man who follows God.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. So he says, do I remember right? He says, for my sins, for the sins of my fathers, and all of Israel, right? Yeah. There's in the Sermon on the Mount, there's a verse, it would be like 5 or 6, when he does the Beatitudes, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted, right? And a lot of times we think about that as grieving a loved one, but there's a deeper reality to that, and that is that mourning of the sin, right? It's I mourn my sin, I mourn the sin of the people who have turned away and do not turn back, right? And so Nehemiah has this need to be comforted by God, because he deeply mourns the sins of not just himself, but all of the people, right? He reminds the Lord about his word, verse 8, and gathering and bringing them back to their land. And then he makes a specific request for himself. What is that request?
Make him successful and grant him compassion before the king.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's praying for that.
Mm-hmm. What is he hoping for?
That he may
Then
be
he'll let him go rebuild the wall.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
city.
I'm starting a class tonight on prayer, and so it's so interesting, because as I've done this, so we're going to use the ACTS prayer model and talk about it, break it down one step at a time. And so we're going to do adoration. I don't know if you're familiar with the ACTS prayer model. It's A for adoration, C for confession, T for thanksgiving, S for supplication. And tonight we're going to talk about adoration, but you read this short prayer, and it's such an example of an ACTS prayer, right? He first praises God for who he is. He confesses what he knows to be true about a sinful nature. He thanks God for what he has done, and he asks for what he needs. And it's interesting that I think because this is the way I believe it is best to pray also. He doesn't say, I need you to do this so that this happens, right? He asks for, make your servant successful today and grant him compassion before this man. Let's look that verse up in a couple other places. Let's read it in a more contemporary English translation and see a couple other places. I'm going to do the same. I'm going to pull it up. Nehemiah 1:11. Anybody that's got it in something else, feel free to shout it out or call it out. Oh, CEB is much more specific. Listen to this. When I serve the king his wine today, make him pleased with me and have him do what I ask. That makes me laugh. I'm just wondering what the word compassion is in other places. That's one of the things I'm trying to find. Grant him mercy in the sight of this man. I think that cadence is a little unusual. The TLB, what is TLB? Anybody know what that version is? What is that version? Oh, the Living Bible says, please help me now as I go in and ask the king for a great favor. Put it into his heart to be kind to me. That's much simpler, I think.
Mine says grant him mercy in the sight of this man.
I think that's an unusual way to say it. That's what I'm poking at that a little bit because I'm like, grant him mercy.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's almost like a third person prayer. It's one of those things where someone says oneself instead of myself. Kind of thing. Is that what's going on maybe?
Oneself. Grant him mercy, him being Nehemiah.
Yes.
Yes. And grant him mercy in the sight of this man. How does it say? I'm sorry. I'm doing this like right now. So it says, yes, I see what you're saying, Denise. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Make your servant successful today, Nehemiah, and grant him, your servant, that's how I marked it even, Nehemiah, compassion before this man. So, like, make him be nice to me. That's what it's, yeah.
Yes.
Because he's already said, we're not supposed to do this. I'm going to ask him for something. We learned that, as we studied a little bit deeper, we'll get to that in just a second. Yeah, that makes more sense as I'm looking at it closer.
One thing it seems to me about the kings of this time is that their favor is fickle.
Oh, very.
And their decisions are fickle.
Yes.
I mean, these are people who change their mind on a dime.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's like when you think about in Esther, when Mordecai wants her to go before the king, and she says, I haven't seen him, I haven't heard from him in 30 days, right? I think it's 30 days. He hasn't even requested me in 30 days. And if I go in there unannounced, he can kill me. Now, not too long before that, she was the one he picked, right? I mean, that was more of like a sexual thing, I know, but she was, she was the one that he picked, and he elevated her to a place of king. Now he hasn't even seen her, and he could kill her if she goes before him. I mean, that's like, that's pretty fickle, I would say. Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. Anything else? Any other application or thoughts on chapter 1? Anything we missed as we were kind of going through there that stood out to you? Before we move into 2.
I was very interested in what I read about the walls, not just in the various passages, but also what I read outside of that. The implication was that if you have something that's valuable, you put a wall around it to protect it. A city without walls is a city that's without value. And to think about Jerusalem being the city that has no value was absolutely the opposite of what God intended for that place. He intended for his very presence to dwell there and for it to be unprotected and without walls. You understand, I had to look up reproach. You understand their disgrace.
Yeah.
Why this city was disgraced.
Yeah, and I think that we talked about this last week. I think that's a great point because now God's dwelling place is our heart, right? And we are to. I think it sounds unusual. Maybe as we study a little bit more, we can come up with a place. But we are to guard the dwelling place of God in our lives with the same dedication that those people wanted to guard the dwelling place of God in that day, right? Because he has promised us riches and treasures, and they come in forms of rest and joy and hope and peace, right? But we only can claim and hold on to those treasures if we keep the enemy out and we guard our heart by walling it. I kind of don't like that because it sounds like, because we use that like emotional, like she has a wall up, like it, I don't want to go there because that's not what that means. But we only guard the treasures that have been granted to us, that have been bestowed upon us, if we have a barrier of protection around God's dwelling place so that the enemy cannot penetrate, right?
Because it's valuable. That's a valuable thing.
Right.
You have to protect.
Right.
It, and it's not. It's you need to protect your very soul.
Yes.
Sometimes, especially
Yes.
in the atmosphere in America right now, there's a lot of hatred.
Yes.
If you don't protect your soul from that, you can start to
Yes.
participate in it.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. And so it is a decision, a life decision that we redecide every day how we're going to participate in that, right? Yeah. And hate is not new by any stretch of the imagination, but the hate that we live with now is ours to navigate and decide how we will respond. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so chapter 2 on your at a glance. I should have done this when we were on with the at a glance earlier. Anybody for chapter theme for chapter 2?
Building the wall.
Rebuilding the wall. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Mine was twofold again. I just kind of wordy, maybe.
Yeah, me too.
Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem, and the Jews agrees to arise and build.
Okay. I put Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem / meets opposition. I think this for me anyway, this encountering of opposition, it has one of the things that I'm still growing in is to anticipate opposition when we begin to build in the name of God, right? And so I think that the fact that it's here, that it's quick, and that it's quite annoying, seriously annoying, is something for us to take note of as we move through this, like, as we think our own application. So, yeah. But all of that is good.
The commentary I read said that it's not during the prayer, it's not during the planning typically that we meet the opposition. It's when you start to do something in the name of the Lord.
Right. When we arise and build. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because we can have an intimate encounter with God or receive his direction, and that can be good, but that's between us and him, right? We can go before the king, even if it's risky, and we can get a go-ahead to move forward. A door can open that will allow us to step through, and that's really between me and God and maybe the king, right? But when we begin to put those walls back, that affects a lot of other people, and they begin to see what God is doing with our life, and they begin to feel the implication of what God is doing as he builds, and they begin to join us in that work, right? And that's something the enemy is like, no. So I'm not too bothered by you getting the direction. I'm not too bothered by the door opening maybe, but you start building, that ticks me off, and so I'll have something to say about it, right? I think.
There was a phrase, he said, when the people said, let us arise and build, Satan said, I will arise and oppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's when he gets interested, is when we start building. Go ahead, Sherry, yeah.
I've got that he pleads and assesses because he spent a lot of time in the middle of the night. He got up and he traveled all around without anyone helping him or knowing it. Mm-hmm. And he made his own assessment of all the destruction and what had to be done. Mm-hmm. And he spent a lot of time doing that.
Yeah.
So I put
reads and assesses.
Yeah, I think that's good too. Yeah, he doesn't make a lot of quick decisions, right? It's not a lot of quick decisions. He spends time with God. He's methodical in that. He goes around the city, assesses, as Sherry said, assesses the situation so that he has a good understanding of what he's doing. There's a practical reality in our work for God, right? There's a practicalness about it. Yeah, I appreciate that, Sherry. Okay, so in verses 1-8 here in chapter 2 is when, let's see, Nehemiah is recording the answer to his prayer, basically in chapter 1, right? The king has noticed his sadness in verse 2 and notes that it was out of the ordinary for Nehemiah to be sad, right? And based on what we found in Ezra 4, page 14, number 2, because Nehemiah, verse 2 says that Nehemiah is afraid when the king notices his sadness, right? And it says Nehemiah is, and I was very much afraid. And we learned more about this on page 14. I knew, I had read, been taught, studied, whatever before, that part of the reason for being afraid that he noticed his sadness was, and I think I might have mentioned this last week, that it was just not the right thing to do to be sad in the presence of the king, because when you're around the king, kind of for the reasons that Denise just was saying about them being so fickle, right? They need to feel like things are going well and that you're happy and that everybody's happy, and that's a good, and so you weren't sad around the king. And so the fact that he was sad and melancholy was a big deal. But then also we learned it was even deeper than that. On page 14, we learned about in Ezra 4 at the top, you guys, number 2 at the top, what had happened.
So
That's when
the
we read
king
about
received a letter from those 2 guys.
And a couple of you were talking. So Artaxerxes, the current king, had previously commanded the work to stop, right, in Jerusalem. Yeah.
Right. Right.
I read this week in a different commentary that this is chronologically out of order in Ezra, and that probably this decree happened a short time before Nehemiah came to Jerusalem in 445 BC. So it seems like it hasn't been that long that this decree was, or this command was, however you want to, that the work was to stop. So that helps us understand a little bit more about why it took 4 months for him to be pretty sure that this was the direction he needed to go, right? Yeah. Because you think about sometimes when God asks us to do something, or we're aware of a need, what are some of the reasons that we don't want to do it? Let's think about Nehemiah. If we talked about Nehemiah is a person of prominence in the capital city, all right? He's got a good job that's pretty secure, and his boss is a little maybe fickle, or you got to kind of watch it. But mostly you've got a pretty good spot right there, right? Yeah, you're a man that's well respected, right? So you have some security or stability. Also, the thing that God the thing that God is asking you to do it's going to take a lot to get there. It's far, right? It's a mess where God is sending you, and also could easily cost you your job, possibly your life, just by bringing it up as an option in your workplace, right? Anybody, right? This is threatening a lot of things that I think we can probably relate to, even though we aren't cupbearers for a king. So the work had been commanded to stop, issued to stop, and I have this after the remnant returned to Jerusalem and was working on rebuilding it, a letter against it was sent to King Artaxerxes. It referred to Jerusalem as a rebellious and evil, wicked city, damaging to the king's revenue and inciting revolt. The letter was sent by Israel's enemies close to them. I read somewhere that it was Samaritans, but I don't know. King Artaxerxes replied that it was not to be rebuilt until a decree was issued by him. Those who received the king's decree stopped the work by force. This was the same king Nehemiah stood before. And I think it's interesting because when the king says, you look sad, what's going on with you? And then Nehemiah says, let the king live forever. Why should I not be sad? The place of my father's tombs lies desolate, and its gates have been consumed by fire. And then the king asks the key question, does he not, right? What do you want? Right? What do you want? And here is the moment that Nehemiah has been dreading. What do you want? And real quickly, what does Nehemiah do?
Praise.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting. This is actually something I'm talking about tonight in my class, because we see real quick in Nehemiah 2 types of praying here, right? We see this type of praying that's gone on for 4 months, where he has fasted and prayed and talked deeply to God and confessed and been real before him. And then we also see this, now I'm at this moment and I need a 4-second prayer to just remind me and calm my heart, right? Both are good. Both are valid. I think the mistake we make sometimes is thinking the 4 seconds prayer can replace the 4 months prayer, and it simply cannot, right? The 4-second prayer reminds you of what you learned in the 4 months of prayer, right? I think that's an important thing to note. Verses 5, 6, 7, and 8 have some specific things that Nehemiah requests from the king, right? Send me to rebuild Jerusalem. I want to go back. A definite time to do it in return. Verse 6, this is like my plan. He also asks for, not only does he just ask to go, right? But he asks for some specific aid to go. I need letters for the governors. Otherwise, as soon as I leave, I'll be turned back around or whatever, if I don't have passage from you. And then also I need letter for timber. I want resources. So he's not asking for nothing. I want you to do this differently than what you said you're going to do it, because you already said the work had to stop. And not only do I want you to lift that, but I also want you to give me some of what you have so that I can do the work, right? That's what I'm seeing. Anybody see anything different or more? Yeah. So it's a big ask, right?
Yeah. He was prepared with his answer. That was the other thing.
He was prepared with his answer. And why? Where did that come from?
I'm sure during his prayer with the Lord, it was part of his, God guiding him and his own understanding of what was going to be needed as well.
Right. Yeah. Let's see. Page 14 at the bottom. Sorry. On E, in the Ezra 7, if you guys had a chance to look that up, take a quick read of what happened to Ezra in the 7th year of the reign of Artaxerxes. And aren't we in Nehemiah in the 20th year? I think that I remember that.
Yes.
If Nehemiah knew about it, it would have been an encouragement, as it often is to us when we hear of the good hand of the Lord upon others who've been willing to step into difficult situations for the sake of God's kingdom. That's why it's so important to share our stories, right? Share our testimonies, because when we believe that God has been in the work in the life of someone else, then it's easier to hang on to the understanding that God is in our life as well, even though sometimes our feelings overshadow our knowing. But when we can know what happened, that what God did in someone else's life, it can encourage us in our own. Read Ezra 7 when you finish. List any similarities to what you see in Nehemiah 1 and 2. Anything there that were similarities from the Ezra passage?
I was surprised at all the things that Ezra was given.
Yes.
Gold and silver, food and
provisions.
wine. No taxes, appointed judges and court officials. I mean, it was very, very detailed what he was given. Not just like construction materials. He was given a lot of freedom and permission.
Yeah, I think, and that that goes to when someone else is going through something, to note that God gives them authority, as I wrote down, blessing and resources, right? Like when I call you to do something, I equip you, and you are authorized to do it in my name. I will give you what you need in order to get it done. You go with my blessing, and I will equip you. And does that mean we have it all laid out before we go? No, it doesn't. But there is the promise that he will be with us and provide for us as we go. Yeah. How about the one D right above that, Proverbs 21:1? Did you get anything out of that? How does this relate to Nehemiah?
No matter what the king wants, God's will supersedes that.
Mm-hmm.
And the king's heart is just like a channel of water. It can go wherever God leads him
Right.
to. And so,
Yeah.
even though Artaxerxes said no once, doesn't he say no again because his heart is controlled?
Yeah, and I think it's so good to remember that, because sometimes we will look at certain things and think, well, that's the reason I can't do that. That's the obstacle that's there. And we minimize God then, because we make something that's a worldly obstacle a spiritual obstacle, and it's not necessarily. It's crazy the way sometimes things work together to get done that you can't imagine. Like, I could never have seen that happening. How did that happen? But it did happen, because God's like, that's not a big deal to me. When I call you to do something, I will make a way for you. I will make a way for you. Yeah. That doesn't mean every... Go ahead. Yeah, Denise, go ahead. Sorry.
It's me, Chatterbox.
No, you're good.
In the climate of America right now, if you listen to all the rhetoric on both sides of the presidential election, not to be political in any way, but no matter who wins, you could have the feeling that, oh, everything's going to be terrible if this person wins, and everything's going to be terrible if that other person wins. And the reality is that whoever is the president of the United States, his heart is as the channel of water in the hands of God, and God can still use him in whatever way he pleases. And I draw comfort from that.
Yeah.
Knowing that whoever the king or the president or whoever it is, the leader, his heart is still controlled by the sovereign God of the universe.
So yes, and so Nehemiah makes his journey, verse 9, and gives the governors their letters from the king. And then there are two men who are not pleased right away, right? Nehemiah gets there, surprise, here's your opposition. Which has to be the
same
first.
as before.
You get to the hotel and they've given you the wrong room after that long journey. They don't have a room for you, whatever. You meet the opposition right away. But Nehemiah knows what the Lord wants him to do. And there will always be opponents to the work of God, right? There will always be opponents to that.
Even within the church sometimes.
Especially within the church, absolutely. Yeah. I don't think we need to be shy about declaring that. Not that I'm not pushing back. Yeah, I think it, absolutely. I mean, and sometimes, people will say, well, that's a church, or he or she's a pastor or something. I'm like, oh no, there's lots of trouble there too, right? Lots of trouble there too. Yeah. And so then, Nehemiah inspects the walls after he was in Jerusalem for 3 days, I think. I have that in my notes. And he did his inspection at night. And kind of like, except for a few people, kind of did it alone and at night, he, like on his own. Saw for himself the condition.
He'd never been to Jerusalem, had he?
I would think not. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't.
So to see it all firsthand.
Yeah.
I did read somewhere in one of the commentaries that he had never been there before.
Okay. Yeah. I would think not. I don't think there's any mention of that. Yeah.
Also, I think it's very smart of him to do this in cognito, if you would, or in, he was very careful about assessing the city itself. It's not at all boastful about what he intended to do. And, sometimes if we are boastful, God will withdraw himself.
Yeah.
And I think that, it was just purely from his heart that he didn't tell anyone, but he knew what God wanted him to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's really something to be learned from the time he takes to make decisions and to gain information. Yeah, from God
Certainly
and from the
timing,
circumstance.
The timing of his talking to the leaders too, probably.
I wanted to read one thing about just from this Boyce commentary. It says, commentators differ over the size of the city at this time and therefore over the length of the wall Nehemiah was to build. But even by the most modest estimates, the circumference of the city was 1.5 to 2.5 miles. Moreover, the destruction was great, and the stones to be reassembled were massive. And as I read this, try to picture this in your mind. This was not a case of a group of workers merely constructing a garden fence, a brick wall, or even a large earthwork fortification. The blocks that had been tumbled down into the valleys below were of great weight, and these had to be exposed and then hauled back up to the site of the wall and reassembled. This required many workers, diverse skills, and even, we may suppose, a certain amount of lifting and moving machinery. So I get this image in my mind, right? I mean, we talked last week about how these, the stones for the walls, had like grass and moss and things growing over them and trees. And so there was like this clearing that had to be done. And these rocks, these stones were massive. And 1.5 to 2.5 miles of destruction. And how are we going to fix this? I can imagine the longer he rode around there looking at that stuff, the more heavy his heart came, right? Because you're like, good grief, I don't even know how we're going to get this done. So I think it's important to, and he tells the people, verse 17, right? This is bad. I can't remember how it goes. What does he say?
Angie,
Yeah.
I read something I thought was interesting. I just will share real quickly. When he went to inspect the wall, I think NIV uses the word viewed, and the word viewed was a medical term in that era, and it was like probing a wound to see the extent of the damage.
Okay.
And I just found that very interesting because that's really exactly what he was doing with that wall.
Yeah.
He was seeing the extent of the damage, and almost like a doctor would do.
Yeah. Because I can't fix you if I don't know what's wrong.
Yeah. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just found that it's an interesting tidbit.
No, it is. Yeah. Laura put up, did you guys see this comment that Laura's putting up from verse 14 where it says there was no place for my mount to pass? I'm going to read what this says. There was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. This speaks to the absolute destruction. If you've seen pictures of Murfreesboro after the 1925 tornado, they help us envision how complete the destruction was. I think that's a very good point. Yeah. Laura, I think that's excellent. When we've seen, whether it's after Katrina or some of those things when you see those pictures on the news, you're like, where do you start with that? Just where do you start? Because it's just so massive. The destruction is so massive. Yeah. And just feels overwhelming. So, and so then on page 10, we looked up some things about the wall and the importance of the wall. Page 10, number 6. I'm just watching our time a little bit, so I'm going to kind of go through these, and if you guys want to shout out anything else, you can. In the Joshua reference, we learned that when we don't have walls, that armies can invade, right? Enemy armies can invade. In the 2nd Samuel, they talked about how you can shoot at the enemies from the wall, right? The wall gives you a place where you can get high and shoot, or hide and shoot. 2 Samuel C, you can watch from the wall and stay alert, right? In D, we learned that Solomon built the palace, the temple, and the wall. And so in 17, what does he say? He says, you see the bad situation we're in, right? This is bad, people. Yeah. But let us rebuild the wall so that we will no longer be a reproach. And I'm just curious, so that we will no longer be, anybody else have a word besides reproach?
I looked that word up because reproach didn't mean to me. And what I discovered was that it meant disgrace.
Yes.
Kind of.
Yeah.
They were a disgrace to the Lord because this was supposed to be his dwelling place.
Right. Yeah.
And here it is in ruins.
Yeah. This is mockable right now, right? Laughable. I mean, it's heart-wrenching because of the destruction, but also this place that we're in is almost like embarrassing. too, right? Mm-hmm.
The NIV version actually uses the word disgrace.
Disgrace. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that does help, because reproach kind of sounds like I don't know what, like you're mad or something, right? Yeah. I get that feeling from that word. And then he reasons with them in 18, reminds them that God's hand is favorable on him. And he told them what King Artaxerxes had said in granting his requests. And then we get to this 2:18 that I feel like, for me anyway, is just the key of all of it, the middle part of this. I told them, verse 18, I told them how the hand of God had been favorable to me, and also about the king's words which had spoken to me. So this is what God has done already in me. I'm sharing my testimony, okay? I know how bad the situation is. I know how bad it looks. But let me tell you, I have been before God, and he sent me before the king, and the king, in this crazy turn of events, has granted us permission and given us resources to do this, okay? So God's hand, it seems like, right, that God's hand is on this project. It's been favorable to me, and this is what the king spoke to me. And then they said, I think that's key, right? In response to what Nehemiah said, they said, let us arise and build. And so then they put their hands to the good work. All right. This is what God has done in me. This is how he's equipped us to do this. And the people said, then let's get to work. Right? But, verse 19, then what happens? When the people decide they're going to build, what happens next?
Immediately, our bad guys are back saying, nah, this isn't going to work.
The bad guys are back, and they've brought a friend even, right? This is the part, right? And so here, yeah. And so let us arise and build, and the opposition, yeah. And I think we have to prepare ourselves for that, ladies. I think we have to know it's coming. Because the opposition is going to be difficult no matter what. But if we can recognize it for what it is, we are already in a place of standing firm, right? Aha, I knew you were going to show up. I didn't know you'd show up like that, but I knew you were coming. And I think that's just a different attitude than laying down face first in the carpet, crying in defeat. Not that I've ever done that before. I mean, I'm just guessing that it could feel like that.
You've heard.
I have a friend. So the enemies mocked them, verse 19, and they questioned them. They even accused them of rebelling, right, in 19. So they make it personal, because that's what attacks do. They mocked us, and they despised us, and they said, who do you think you are? Anybody, right? When you step out to do something that God has called you to do, they mock you, they despise you, and they say, who do you think you are? And then Nehemiah answers them. This is one of my favorite things, because he talks truth. And what does Nehemiah say?
God will give us success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And why does he say that? How does he know that?
Because of all that's gone before in his prayer.
That's right.
This is God's will, or he wouldn't even be there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. The God of heaven will give us success. So he's basically turning it off of himself. You can mock me. You can despise me. You can ask, who do I think I am? This is not about me. I'm here just as a servant of the Almighty. I will not do this. I can't do this. Look at this mess. I'm one man, right? I can't fix this. This is a mess. If it's going to be fixed, God will fix it. And God's already told me he's going to fix it. So we have to stand. I don't know how he's going to fix it. It seems too big to me too. Because that's the thing. I was talking to somebody just yesterday, and they were like, the thing that we have to wrestle with when we're under attack is the piece of truth that's in there, right? Because if it came, what her example was, if I'm going to use Lisa because I can pick on Lisa. If Lisa was stepping out to do something for God, and I was the opposition for that, and I was saying, mocking her and despising her, and who do you think you are? If I said, you are a gray elephant and you weigh 800 pounds, she would not need to worry about that, because everybody knows that's not true, because she's not a gray elephant that weighs 800 pounds, right? But if I say, you aren't smart enough to do this thing that you think you are. You don't have the credentials. You don't have the education. Who do you think you are? There's just enough truth in that, probably.
For heaven's sake.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry. What, Denise?
You're a servant, for heaven's
Yeah,
sake.
right. There's just enough truth in that, is there not, to mess with us. All right?
Yes.
Yeah, right. And that's just a bad example. But it's, but I think it's important for us to remember that the things that the way the attack is going to come will likely be, the source is going to be surprising, and the attack itself will have a bit of truth to it, or it wouldn't bother us so much. And so what's our answer, right? Yeah, what's our answer? So he says, the God of heaven will give us success. Therefore, I like the thing, like, if you don't like what I'm doing, take it up with God, not me, because I'm trying. This is about what I've heard from God. Therefore, we, his servants.
I mean, he took no heritage in this whatsoever. It's just that, well, tough luck.
Yeah.
God's going to take care of it and make it all happen.
Yeah. And we, his servants, are going to participate in what he's calling us to do. We will arise and build. And then, just for fun, he says, and you have no right here anyway. You don't get to be here. Yeah.
That was confusing to me at first, because I was like, why would he even add that? But as I read, apparently these are Jews.
Mm.
At least Tobiah and Sanballat are of Jewish. They're sons of Israel, so to speak. That's what was in the commentary.
Is it?
And so God is
Oh.
going to be part of it.
Are other people nodding about that too?
I don't know.
I read that Sanballat was from Samaria.
Yeah, I have a question mark around that. Not about you, Denise, but just about, that's what happens because we read different things, but that's good to read different things and find. Let's see, we have just a minute. Let's see if we can find.
And this was enduring word that I read. It said that they both had priestly ties to the.
Oh, one of them was married. Okay, am I right about this? One of these men was married to the high priest's daughter? No.
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. And so not a Jew, but yes.
Yeah, David Guzik or whoever it is said they were both Jews, and I was very surprised by that because of where it says they're from.
Yeah, I am too, but I'm gonna
governor of Samaria.
I do a bad job of looking things up while I'm teaching, but I'll try real quick to just look it up so that we can. What do you know if it was in verse 20? Was the answer in? Yeah. So Nehemiah sized. I'm just going to read it. Nehemiah sized these two up more quickly than we often do. He knew they weren't for him or for Jerusalem or for God, though they may have claimed to be. It was as if Nehemiah says, you don't belong here, God's doing a great work here, and you don't want to be a part of it, just move on. We can say the same to our spiritual enemies. You have no heritage or right or memorial in me. I belong to Jesus Christ. You don't belong here. You may as well move on because I'm not going anywhere. The opposition did not immediately melt away. We often wish that if we did everything right as Nehemiah did here, that the opposition would just go away, but it didn't. These two opposed the work all the way until it was finished, but they didn't stop it. God's work got done, and they were proved completely wrong.
Are you asking about the relationship? What I see an enduring word is
Who are they?
a Jewish name.
Jewish names?
Yeah, Tobiah is a Jewish name.
Uh-huh.
And I did read that Sanballat was the governor of Samaria.
He was connected by marriage to priestly family.
Okay. All right.
I read that too.
So I see that now on B, up there under 19.
Well, I've got Angie in the book that you don't want to know.
We're not going to get our answer from MacArthur today, are we?
We just might.
All right.
These men were probably also behind the opposition described in Ezra, which we read earlier.
Yes.
Work in Jerusalem. Sanballat served as governor of Samaria. Her own name was a town in Moab, and he was probably a Moabite. And Tobiah was of the region east of the Jordan River. These district magistrates were leaders of Samaritan factions to the north and east. So does that mean that they're Samaritans?
I don't know.
Yeah, well, and Samaritans would have been part Jewish. I do see, David,
That's right.
in Enduring Word, Guznak, in number 3 under 19, I do see exactly what Denise is saying. Was not questioning that. I just wanted to read it. He says, these men were Jews or fellow brothers of Nehemiah and the citizens of Jerusalem. We might have thought they would have supported his work, but they do not. Opposition is always difficult, but when it comes from brothers, it is then mixed with the pain of betrayal as well. So I think there's some question. I'm leaning towards, with all of it, in a very quick look at these things, I'm leaning towards the belief that either by marriage or with some blood, that they had some Jewish heritage or connection, which again adds to the half-truth, does it not? Because it's one thing, when people who, if we're doing work for God and people who do not love Jesus, do not want to follow Jesus, if they have an opinion about what we're doing, it's easier to dismiss, right? Because we know that they don't live their life according to the leading of the Holy Spirit. But if you've got somebody that's a sister, or at least appears to be a sister, or in some ways a sister in Christ, questions our motives, or accuses us of something else, that feels a little bit more different, a little different, does it not? And so we have to wrestle with that at a deeper place, I think. So
It's probably one of the examples of.
At the very least, they were spiritual enemies.
yeah, Lisa, what goes to what?
Fairly a country representing a country of being an enemy.
Uh-huh.
They definitely were spiritual enemies.
Yeah.
Another thing is, I think there's even like a spiritual prophecy or even a curse, because he ends with, "You have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem." So as the wall gets built, Nehemiah goes in great detail, or Ezra goes in great detail, who built each part of the wall, and even their family members. And they're all given credit. And now we know that these 3 men, it's the opposite, that they are going to be always known as the roadblocks. So it's almost like a curse on their family that they didn't help, and they even tried to obstruct the work of God.
Yep, good point. Lisa, I'm going to circle back to you again. What did you say about that? Yeah.
When you're talking about somebody else that actually is a Christian, butting heads, that's kind of the thing you get in church.
Yeah.
When you were talking about that, I was just thinking about people in churches that are at odds.
Yes.
You would think that it would not be that way, but we're human.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Okay, what else? I want to, Laura has a good comment in here too about the rise up in work. The word complacency keeps coming to mind. I suspect that is one of Satan's favorite tactics. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Angie, did you do a chapter theme for 2?
Yeah.
I think it was when I got kicked off. I was in and out a couple times.
Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem / meets opposition.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. What else today? Okay, that was good, I think. Anything else? That takes us to the end. Yeah, of 2. So.
There are a lot of what I read when I was finished with my observation. A lot of what I read in the commentary had to do with Nehemiah as a leader. How it has to do with leadership, but I think there's a lot to be said. There's a lot in here, even in these 2 verses, about Nehemiah's relationship and his foundation for whatever it is he's doing, whether you're a leader or not leader. When he heard from God, the way he proceeded is good for all of us to follow.
Yeah, and and I would suggest that we are all leaders. and we may not all be leaders of organizations, but we are leaders in families, or we are leaders in classrooms, or we are leaders of children or grandchildren, or small groups, or we all have circles of influence. Go ahead, Denise. What?
God calls each of us to do something.
Yes,
He
yeah.
has a work for each one of us.
Yeah,
to do.
absolutely. And so I think we have to be real careful about not comparing leadership. You're a leader and I'm not because you lead this and I don't lead that. You lead something else. I really believe that we all have circles of influence, and we can all lead with prayer covered, God honoring decisions or not. Yeah. Good study today. Good work. Yeah, learned some things. I love it. So let's pray together, huh? Father, thank you again so much just for the opportunity to sit and study and learn and just dig for truth in your word. And I just so appreciate what I learned today, Lord, and this example of Nehemiah, who sometimes, Lord, I just want to skip to the part where he gets to stand on the wall and cut the ribbon and say, look, I led the people and we built the wall. But I need to really pay attention to what gets that man there. The time with you, the prayer, the assessment of the situation, the going back to you, the allowing of other people. He didn't try to do it all himself. He knew he needed other people to help him. He was able to lead them, but he gave them sections of the wall that we'll see as we continue to study, and together they did something that benefited everyone, Lord. And so I just lift that as my prayer to you to help me as we study this, Lord. Just really get in tune with what you would have me learn as I allow you to shine a light in my own life, God. I ask a blessing upon us as we continue to study this week. I pray especially for our schedules, Lord, that through whatever way, that whether it's precept or something else, that we make time with you a priority, Lord, and we lift all this in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm going to turn off the Facebook page. If